March 6, 1944, 25,000 feet above Western Germany. Second Lieutenant Frank Burchill pulls his P-51 Mustang into a tight turn, trying to line up on a Messerschmitt Bf 109 that's closing on a damaged B-17. The bomber is trailing smoke from its No. 3 engine, falling behind the formation. Easy prey. Burchill centers the gun sight on the 109. He squeezes the trigger. Nothing. He's out of ammunition. 650 caliber machine guns empty. He'd burned through his entire load during 2 previous engagements. Now, when it matters most, his guns are silent. Below him, the B-17 is helpless. 10 men aboard. The bald turret gunner is probably wounded. The turret isn't tracking. The waist guns are silent. The bomber can't defend itself. The Bf 109 closes from 6 o'clock, lining up for the kill shot. Burchill has seconds to decide. He can break off, watch the bomber die, and live with that memory forever. He can try to bluff the German pilot into breaking off, hoping his reputation will be enough. Or he can do something every regulation, every training manual, every command order strictly forbids. He pushes the throttle forward and aims his fighter directly at the enemy aircraft. Not his guns, his wing. At 400 miles per hour, Burchill's wingtip strikes the Bf 109's right horizontal stabilizer. Metal tears. The German fighter's tail section crumples. The 109 snaps into an uncontrollable spin and plummets toward the earth. Burchill's Mustang shudders violently. The stick jerks in his hand. He fights for control, reducing power, checking his instruments. The aircraft responds sluggishly, but flies. He looks at his right wing. 6 inches of the wingtip are gone, the metal bent and torn. But the wing structure holds. The Mustang remains airworthy. Below him, the B-17 continues its limping flight toward England. 10 men who would have died are still alive. Burchill just saved them using a tactic that should have killed him. A tactic that was illegal, insane, and completely undocumented in any official manual. A tactic that a handful of P-51 pilots discovered independently, used in desperation, and somehow survived. This is the story of the wing strike, when Mustang pilots ran out of ammunition and used their aircraft as weapons. It's a story about engineering, desperation, bomber protection, and the kinds of decisions men make when lives hang in the balance and conventional options have run out. To understand why P-51 pilots would attempt something as dangerous as ramming enemy aircraft with their wings, you need to understand the reality of long-range escort missions over Germany in 1944 and 1945. The P-51 Mustang was armed with 6 Browning M250 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing. These were powerful, reliable weapons with an effective range of about 1,000 yards. The ammunition load varied slightly between P-51 variants, but typically each gun carried between 350 and 400 rounds. That sounds like a lot of ammunition. It wasn't. 50 caliber machine guns fire at approximately 800 rounds per minute. With 6 guns firing simultaneously, the P-51's total rate of fire was roughly 4,800 rounds per minute, or 80 rounds per second. A typical burst lasted 2 to 3 seconds. Longer bursts risked overheating the guns and wasted ammunition on targets that were already hit or had maneuvered out of the line of fire. Most pilots fired in short, controlled bursts. With a full ammunition load of roughly 1,900 rounds, total across all 6 guns, a P-51 pilot could fire for approximately 25 seconds of sustained trigger time. In practice, considering the need to aim, track targets, and avoid wasting ammunition, pilots had ammunition for perhaps 10 to 15 separate firing passes. That was enough for most missions. But escort missions deep into Germany weren't most missions. A typical long-range escort mission from England to targets inside Germany and back could last 5 to 6 hours. During that time, Mustang pilots might encounter multiple waves of German fighters. Luftwaffe tactics in 1944 involved coordinated attacks by large numbers of fighters, attempting to overwhelm the escorts and break through to the bombers. A P-51 pilot might engage enemy fighters on the way to the target, fight through attacks over the target area itself, and face additional interceptions during the return flight. Each engagement consumed ammunition. After 2 or 3 serious dogfights, many pilots found themselves with empty guns while still hours from home. The problem was compounded by mechanical issues. At high altitude, temperatures dropped to 40 or 50 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Gun mechanisms could freeze or jam, lubricants thickened. Spent shell casings sometimes failed to eject properly, causing stoppages. High-G maneuvers during combat could also cause feeding problems. The ammunition belts weren't designed to handle sustained high-G loads. Pilots sometimes found that their guns would jam after violent maneuvers, even with ammunition remaining. Radio communications from escort missions are filled with pilots reporting Winchester, the code word meaning out of ammunition. In large engagements, it wasn't unusual for a quarter or more of the escorting fighters to run dry before the mission ended. When that happened, the pilot faced a choice. He could return to base alone, leaving the bombers with fewer escorts. This was the official procedure. A fighter without ammunition wasn't combat effective and was itself vulnerable to enemy attack. But leaving meant abandoning the bombers he was assigned to protect. It meant watching bomber formations continue deeper into Germany with one fewer escort, and for many P-51 pilots, that was unacceptable. The bond between escort fighters and bomber crews was personal. Mustang pilots knew the bomber crews by name. They shared the same bases. They drank at the same officers' clubs. They understood that every B-17 or B-24 carried 10 men, any of whom could be friends. When a fighter pilot watched a bomber go down in flames, he knew he was watching 10 men die. Parachutes didn't always open. Even when they did, capture by Germans was the best outcome. Many bomber crewmen were killed by civilians on the ground or died from exposure after parachuting into the North Sea. So when P-51 pilots ran out of ammunition, but still had fuel and a flyable aircraft, many chose to stay with the bombers. They continued escorting, hoping their presence alone would deter some attacks. They tried to position themselves aggressively, making German pilots think they were still armed. Sometimes it worked, often it didn't. And a few pilots, faced with German fighters attacking bombers they'd sworn to protect, decided that if their guns were empty, they'd find another weapon. They'd use their wings. The wing strike tactic wasn't invented by a single pilot or developed through official experimentation. It emerged independently, discovered by multiple pilots in moments of desperate improvisation. The first recorded consideration of using the aircraft itself as a weapon came from propeller strikes. Several P-51 pilots, out of ammunition and watching enemy fighters attack their bombers, attempted to fly close enough to strike enemy aircraft with their propellers. This was extraordinarily dangerous. The propeller is the most critical component of a single-engine fighter. Damage to the propeller meant immediate loss of power and likely engine failure. A pilot who struck an enemy aircraft with his propeller would probably go down himself. A few pilots attempted it anyway. The results were usually catastrophic for both aircraft. The tactic was quickly recognized as suicide and abandoned. Some pilots tried using their aircraft's wake turbulence and propeller wash to disrupt enemy fighters. A large aircraft like a bomber creates significant turbulence. A fighter attempting to fly directly behind a bomber risks losing control in the disturbed air. P-51 pilots experimented with flying very close to German fighters, hoping their own wake turbulence would disrupt the enemy's flight path. This worked occasionally, but required precise positioning and often wasn't enough to actually prevent an attack. Then, sometime in late 1943 or early 1944, a few pilots realized something. The P-51's wing was remarkably strong, and German fighter tails were relatively fragile. The exact first use of a wing strike is disputed. Multiple pilots claim to have been the first, and in the chaos of air combat, precise records weren't always kept. What's clear is that by mid-1944, the tactic was known among Mustang squadrons, passed along through informal conversations and debriefings. The technique was simple in concept, terrifying in execution. The P-51 pilot would approach an enemy fighter from an angle, typically from above and behind. Instead of firing guns, the pilot would maneuver to strike the enemy aircraft's tail section with the tip of his wing. The target was usually the horizontal stabilizer, the small wing-like surface at the rear of the aircraft that controls pitch. This was one of the most vulnerable parts of a fighter aircraft. It was made of thin aluminum, often unarmored and relatively small. Damage to the horizontal stabilizer made an aircraft uncontrollable. The physics were brutal. A P-51 wing striking a thin aluminum stabilizer at a relative closing speed of several hundred miles per hour would shear through the stabilizer like a cleaver through sheet metal. The German fighter would lose elevator control instantly and enter an uncontrolled spin or dive. Meanwhile, the P-51 would suffer damage to its wingtip. The outer few inches of wing might be bent, torn, or completely severed. But if the impact occurred near the very tip of the wing, the structural damage might be limited to a relatively small area. This was the key insight. Wingtips are not structurally critical. The root of the wing, where it attaches to the fuselage, carries almost all the aerodynamic load. The wingtip contributes relatively little to total lift. An aircraft can lose several inches or even a foot of wingtip and remain flyable. The P-51's wing design made this especially true. The Mustang used a laminar flow airfoil, a then revolutionary design that reduced drag by maintaining smooth airflow over the wing surface. This design required a very stiff wing structure to maintain the precise airfoil shape. As a result, P-51 wings were exceptionally rigid and strong. They had to be to handle the aerodynamic loads at high speed while maintaining the laminar flow profile. This rigidity meant the wing could withstand impacts that would have destroyed the wings of other aircraft. But even with a strong wing, the tactic was insane by any normal standard. Every regulation, every training manual, every command order emphasized the absolute rule: never allow your aircraft to collide with another aircraft. Mid-air collisions were almost always fatal. Ramming was considered a last resort tactic used only by Soviet pilots in the early years of the war, when their aircraft were inferior and their training limited. American pilots were trained in precision gunnery, not kamikaze-style ramming. Attempting to deliberately strike another aircraft with your wing violated every principle of aerial combat. It risked your life, destroyed your aircraft, and even if successful, left you crippled over enemy territory. But when German fighters were seconds away from killing 10 men in a bomber you'd sworn to protect, and your guns were empty and you had no other option, some pilots decided the rules didn't matter anymore. They became the weapon. The reason P-51 pilots could attempt wing strikes and survive was fundamentally about engineering. The Mustang's wing design gave it capabilities that made an impossible tactic merely extremely dangerous. The P-51 Mustang was designed by North American Aviation in 1940 as a long-range escort fighter. The design brief emphasized range, speed, and high-altitude performance. These requirements led to a wing design that was unusual for its time: the laminar flow airfoil. Traditional aircraft wings of the 1930s and early 1940s used airfoils designed to generate maximum lift. These wings were relatively thick, with curved upper surfaces that accelerated airflow and created lift through pressure differences. They worked well, but created significant drag, especially at high speeds. The laminar flow airfoil took a different approach. It used a thinner profile with the maximum thickness positioned farther back along the chord. This shape encouraged smooth, laminar airflow over the wing surface rather than turbulent flow. Laminar flow reduced drag dramatically. The P-51 had one of the lowest drag coefficients of any World War II fighter, which translated directly into higher speed and longer range. With the same engine as other fighters, the Mustang could fly faster and farther, but maintaining laminar flow required extremely precise wing construction. The surface had to be perfectly smooth. The airfoil shape had to be maintained exactly under all flight conditions. Any flexing or warping of the wing would disrupt the laminar flow and negate the aerodynamic advantages. To achieve this, North American Aviation designed the P-51's wing with exceptional structural rigidity. The main wing spar, the primary load-bearing beam that runs the length of the wing, was massive and extremely strong. The wing skin was thicker than on comparable fighters. The entire wing structure was designed to resist bending and twisting under aerodynamic loads. This rigidity had an unintended consequence. The P-51's wing could withstand impacts that would have destroyed other aircraft's wings. Compare this to German fighters of the same period. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 used a relatively conventional wing design optimized for maneuverability at medium altitudes. The wing was lighter and more flexible than the Mustangs, which gave the 109 excellent roll rate and turning performance. But the 109's tail surfaces were lightly built. The horizontal stabilizer was a thin aluminum structure with minimal internal bracing. It was designed to handle aerodynamic loads from normal flight and combat maneuvers, not impact forces. When a rigid, heavy P-51 wingtip traveling at several hundred miles per hour struck a lightly built 109 stabilizer, the physics were one-sided. The stabilizer would crumple or shear off completely. The Mustang wingtip would be damaged, but the main wing structure would remain intact. Pilots who survived wing strikes reported similar experiences. The impact felt like hitting something solid at high speed, because they were. The aircraft would shudder violently. The controls would feel strange, often with reduced response in roll, but the aircraft would still fly. Post-flight inspections typically showed damage to the outer 12 to 18 inches of the wing. The wingtip structure would be bent, torn, or completely missing. The wing skin might be ripped. Leading edge damage was common, but the damage was cosmetic and aerodynamic, not structural. The main wing spar remained intact. The fuel tanks in the wings weren't ruptured. The control surfaces, ailerons and flaps, usually remained functional. A P-51 with a damaged wingtip flew poorly. It would have asymmetric lift, causing the aircraft to roll or yaw in one direction. The pilot would have to hold constant control pressure to maintain level flight. Landing would be more difficult, requiring careful speed and attitude control. But it could be flown home. And in combat over Germany, flying home with a damaged wingtip was infinitely better than not flying home at all. The Focke-Wulf FW-190 presented a similar situation. Its tail surfaces were slightly more robust than the 109's, but still vulnerable to wing strikes. Several documented cases exist of P-51s successfully striking FW-190 stabilizers and surviving. This wasn't a universal capability. The P-47 Thunderbolt, another American escort fighter, had a radial engine mounted in the nose. This engine was extremely heavy, shifting the aircraft's center of gravity forward. P-47 pilots who attempted wing strikes risked severe control problems because the damaged wing would create even more asymmetry with the heavy nose. British Spitfires had beautiful, elliptical wings optimized for maneuverability, but these wings were more flexible than the Mustangs, designed to flex under load rather than resist it. A Spitfire wing striking a solid object was more likely to suffer catastrophic structural failure. The P-51 was unique. Its combination of wing strength, structural rigidity, and aerodynamic design created a fighter that could survive impacts no other aircraft could handle. None of this made wing strikes safe. They were still extraordinarily dangerous. Pilots who attempted them were taking massive risks. The margin for error was microscopic, but the engineering made them possible. And in the desperate air war over Germany, possible was enough. The wing strike tactic wasn't common, but it was real. Several cases are documented in official combat reports, pilot memoirs, and post-war interviews. These are the stories of men who made impossible decisions and survived. Case 1. Lieutenant Urban Ben Drew, January 14, 1945. Lieutenant Urban Drew was flying a P-51D with the 361 Fighter Group, escorting B-17s near Hamburg. The mission had been brutal. German fighters attacked in waves, and Drew had already engaged multiple enemy aircraft. During one engagement, Drew's guns jammed. All 650 caliber machine guns stopped firing simultaneously, likely due to a feeding problem caused by the violent maneuvering of the Dogfight. Drew cleared the jam and checked his ammunition. He had perhaps 5 seconds of firing time remaining across all 6 guns. Not enough for another serious engagement. Then he saw 2 Messerschmitt Me Tu-62 jet fighters approaching the bomber formation. The Me Tu-62 was the first operational jet fighter, far faster than any propeller-driven aircraft. If the jets attacked, the bombers would be slaughtered. Drew accelerated toward the jets. The Me Tu-62s were in a shallow dive, building speed for their attack run. Drew positioned himself above and behind one of the jets. He fired his remaining ammunition in a single, long burst. Some rounds struck the jet, but not enough to bring it down. The Me Tu-62 began to pull away, its superior speed carrying it out of range. Drew pushed his throttle to the firewall and dove after the jet. He later described his thinking. He wasn't going to let the jet attack his bombers. If he couldn't shoot it down, he'd ram it. As he closed on the Me Tu-62, Drew aimed for the jet's tail section. At the last moment, the German pilot saw him coming and attempted to evade. The evasion meant Drew's aircraft didn't hit the fuselage. Instead, his right wingtip struck the Me Tu-62's left horizontal stabilizer. The jet's stabilizer crumpled. The Me Tu-62 entered an immediate uncontrolled roll and plunged toward the ground. The German pilot ejected, but his parachute didn't open in time. The Me Tu-62 crashed near Lüneburg. Drew's Mustang shuddered violently from the impact. The right wingtip was bent upward at a sharp angle, with approximately 8 inches of the tip torn away. The aircraft pulled hard to the right, and Drew had to use both hands on the stick to maintain control. He nursed the damaged Mustang back to England, flying with constant left aileron pressure to counteract the asymmetric lift. He landed successfully at his base, though the landing was challenging due to the reduced roll authority. Ground crew examined the wing. The damage was severe, but localized to the wingtip area. The main wing structure was intact. The Mustang was repaired and returned to service within a week. Drew received the Distinguished Service Cross for this action, though the official citation focused on his pursuit and destruction of the Me Tu-62, not specifically on the ramming technique. The wing strike itself was mentioned in the combat report, but not emphasized. Case 2. Second Lieutenant Frank Burchill, March 6, 1944. We open this documentary with Burchill's story. Here are the full details. Frank Burchill was flying a P-51B with the 354th Fighter Group, escorting B-17s deep into Germany. The mission encountered heavy German fighter opposition. Burchill engaged multiple Bf-10-9s, expending his ammunition in 2 separate dogfights. With empty guns, Burchill remained with the bomber formation. Standard procedure would have been to return to base. But Burchill decided to stay, hoping his presence would deter some attacks. He saw a Bf-109 closing on a damaged B-17 that had fallen behind the formation. The bomber was clearly in trouble, one engine was smoking, and the defensive guns appeared to be silent or out of ammunition. The Bf-109 was positioning for a textbook stern attack, approaching from directly behind where the bomber had minimal defensive fire. Burchill knew that if the 109 completed its attack run, the B-17 would almost certainly be destroyed. Burchill pushed his throttle forward and dove toward the 109. He later stated that his intention was to distract or intimidate the German pilot into breaking off the attack, but as he closed, he realized the 109 pilot hadn't seen him and wasn't going to break off. Burchill made a split-second decision. He aimed his fighter at the 109's tail and deliberately struck the right horizontal stabilizer with his left wingtip. The impact severed the 109's stabilizer almost completely. The German fighter immediately lost pitch control and entered a flat spin. The pilot bailed out successfully and parachuted to the ground. Burchill's Mustang suffered damage to the outer 6 inches of the left wing. The wingtip was bent and torn, but the wing structure held. He experienced significant control difficulties, particularly in roll, but managed to keep the aircraft under control. The B-17 he'd saved continued flying and eventually made it back to England, landing safely at an emergency airfield with multiple wounded crew members aboard. Burchill flew his damaged Mustang back across Germany, across occupied France, across the English Channel. He landed at his base, though the ground crew later said the landing was rough and the Mustang required extensive repairs. Burchill's squadron commander debriefed him personally. The commander's response, according to Burchill's later interviews, was, "Don't ever do that again. Good job." The combat report mentioned that Burchill destroyed a Bf-109 through unconventional means. No official commendation was issued. The Army Air Force didn't want to encourage tactics that deliberately damaged American aircraft, but word spread through the fighter groups. Burchill's action became part of the informal knowledge shared among pilots. When you ran out of ammunition, there were options, dangerous options, but options. Case 3. The Bomber Defense Ram, October 1944. This case is less well documented because the pilot's identity was never definitively confirmed. Multiple pilots from different squadrons claimed to have been involved, and the confusion was never fully resolved. What is known? During a large bomber raid in October 1944, a P-51 pilot whose guns had jammed observed a formation of 3 FW-190s setting up for a coordinated attack on a B-24 Liberator bomber that had fallen out of formation. The P-51 pilot attempted to disrupt the attack by flying aggressively toward the German fighters. 2 of the FW-190s broke off. The third continued its attack approach, apparently either not seeing the Mustang or believing it was no threat without ammunition. The P-51 pilot struck the FW-190's tail with his wingtip. The FW-190's rudder and right stabilizer were severely damaged. The German fighter became uncontrollable and spiraled down. The pilot was not observed to bail out. The P-51 lost approximately 4 inches of its right wingtip but remained flyable. The pilot returned to England and landed safely. The B-24 bomber crew reported the incident through their debriefing. They stated that they believed the P-51 pilot had deliberately rammed the German fighter to save their aircraft. All 10 crew members of the B-24 survived the mission. The P-51 pilot involved never came forward publicly. The official combat report listed the FW-190 as destroyed by ramming, but no award or commendation was issued. It's possible the pilot feared disciplinary action for deliberately damaging his aircraft. The pattern. These 3 cases share common elements. In each instance, the pilot was out of ammunition or had weapons failures. In each case, German fighters were attacking bombers the P-51 pilot had been assigned to protect. In each case, the pilot made a conscious decision to use his aircraft as a weapon rather than watch the bombers be destroyed. And in each case, the pilot survived. The structural integrity of the P-51's wing allowed them to inflict catastrophic damage on enemy aircraft while sustaining damage that, while serious, was not fatal. These weren't accidents. These weren't mid-air collisions during maneuvering. These were deliberate, calculated uses of the aircraft as a weapon. The emotional weight of these decisions is difficult to convey. These pilots knew they might die. They knew they were violating every rule. They knew that even if they survived, they might face disciplinary action. But they also knew that if they did nothing, men would die. Friends, fellow Americans, 10 men per bomber, any of whom had families waiting at home. The choice, once framed that way, became simple. Break the rules and save lives, or follow the rules and watch men burn. They broke the rules. To understand why P-51 pilots would attempt wing strikes, you need to understand the desperate situation facing American bomber crews in 1943 and 1944. The United States Army Air Forces pursued a strategy of daylight precision bombing against Germany. The theory was that American bombers, flying in tight defensive formations and armed with numerous machine guns, could penetrate German airspace in daylight, accurately bomb strategic targets, and return home with acceptable losses. The reality was far more costly than predicted. In 1943, before long-range escort fighters became available, B-17 and B-24 bombers flew deep into Germany without fighter protection. German fighters attacked in coordinated waves, exploiting the bombers' blind spots and weak defensive positions. The loss rates were staggering. On some missions, 10% or more of the attacking force was shot down. The August 17, 1943 raid on Schweinfurt and Regensburg resulted in 60 bombers lost out of 376 dispatched, a loss rate of nearly 16%. Bomber crews faced a mathematical nightmare. They were required to complete 25 missions to finish a tour of duty. But if the average loss rate was 5% per mission, basic probability showed that fewer than 30% of crews would survive 25 missions. The psychological impact was devastating. Bomber crews knew statistically that they were likely to be killed before completing their tour. They watched friends die. They saw bombers explode or plunge in flames. They witnessed mid-air collisions, catastrophic mechanical failures, and the aftermath of fighter attacks that left bombers shredded and falling. The introduction of long-range escort fighters in late 1943 and early 1944 changed the equation. P-51 Mustangs could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, providing protection throughout the mission. Loss rates dropped immediately. With fighter escorts, bomber losses on deep penetration missions fell to 3 or 4%, sometimes lower. This was still high by any standard, but it was a dramatic improvement. But the presence of escorts created a new dynamic: the personal relationship between fighter pilots and bomber crews. Fighter pilots and bomber crews were based at the same airfields. They ate in the same mess halls. They drank in the same clubs. They knew each other's names, hometowns, girlfriends, and families. When a fighter pilot escorted bombers on a mission, he wasn't protecting abstract assets. He was protecting Mike, the B-17 pilot from Ohio. He was protecting the crew of Lucky Lady, who'd completed 23 missions and was so close to going home. He was protecting men he'd played poker with last night. This personal connection created a sense of responsibility that went beyond official duty. Fighter pilots felt personally accountable for bringing the bombers home. When a bomber was shot down, escort pilots felt they had failed, even if they'd done everything possible. Luftwaffe fighter tactics in 1944 exploited the escort's limitations. German pilots knew that American escort fighters had to stay close to the bombers to protect them. If German fighters could draw the escorts away from the bomber formation, they could then attack the bombers freely. German tactics also focused on attacks from positions where American escorts couldn't effectively engage. The tail chase attack, approaching from directly behind a bomber, put the German fighter in the bomber's blind spot where defensive guns had limited traverse. Escorts had difficulty engaging from this position without risking hitting the bomber they were trying to protect. High-angle diving attacks from above and behind were similarly difficult for escorts to counter. The German fighter would dive through the formation at high speed, fire a burst, and be gone before escorts could react. These tactics forced American fighter pilots into reactive postures. They had to wait for German fighters to commit to an attack before engaging, which sometimes meant German fighters got shots at the bombers before they could be stopped. For fighter pilots, watching German fighters line up on bombers they were supposed to protect, knowing the bombers were about to be hit, was psychologically devastating. Some pilots described it as worse than being shot at themselves. When a pilot ran out of ammunition in this situation, the sense of helplessness was overwhelming. German fighters were attacking, bombers were dying, and the pilot had no way to stop it because his guns were empty. This is the context in which wing strikes emerged. They weren't glory-seeking stunts. They weren't aggressive tactics designed to maximize kill counts. They were desperate, last-resort actions by pilots who couldn't stand watching their bombers die when they still had an aircraft capable of flight. The bombers represented more than military assets. They represented friends, fellow Americans, men with families who deserved to go home. When faced with the choice between following regulations and saving those men, some pilots chose to save the men. The wing strike tactic embodied this desperation. It was dangerous, probably stupid, and completely unauthorized, but it worked. And in the brutal mathematics of air combat over Germany, that was all that mattered. Wing strikes existed in a legal and ethical gray area that Army Air Force commanders struggled to address. Officially, the tactic was completely forbidden. Army Air Force regulations explicitly prohibited pilots from deliberately colliding with enemy aircraft. The reasoning was straightforward. Ramming was almost always fatal to the pilot attempting it and guaranteed the loss of an expensive aircraft. In the Pacific Theater, Japanese kamikaze tactics had demonstrated the fanaticism and desperation of enemy pilots willing to die to damage American forces. The United States military wanted no part of similar tactics. American pilots were trained to destroy the enemy while preserving their own lives and aircraft. Ramming, even with the intention of surviving, was considered reckless endangerment. A pilot who deliberately damaged his aircraft was potentially subject to court-martial for destruction of government property and violation of flight safety regulations. But in practice, commanders faced a dilemma. If a pilot used a wing strike to save a bomber, and both the pilot and the bomber survived, was that really a violation worth punishing? Most commanders chose to look the other way. When pilots returned with damaged wingtips and combat reports describing wing strikes, the official response was usually a stern warning not to repeat the action, combined with unofficial acknowledgement that the pilot had done what he had to do. Some commanders were more explicit. One squadron commander was quoted as telling his pilots, "If you ram a German fighter, I'll recommend you for a medal. If you get yourself killed doing it, I'll recommend you posthumously, but I'd prefer you didn't do it at all because I need you alive." The Air Force couldn't officially condone the tactic, but they couldn't bring themselves to punish pilots who used it successfully. The compromise was to discourage the tactic through official channels while tolerating it when it occurred. Pilot opinion was divided. Some considered wing strikes to be justified last-resort tactics. Others thought they were reckless grandstanding that endangered the pilot for marginal benefit. The argument against wing strikes focused on risk versus reward. A pilot who damaged his aircraft attempting a wing strike might lose control and crash, resulting in the loss of both pilot and aircraft. Even if he survived, he was flying home in a damaged aircraft over hostile territory, increasing the chance he'd be shot down or forced to bail out. From a cold strategic perspective, losing an experienced fighter pilot to save a single bomber was arguably a poor trade. Fighter pilots took months to train and were more difficult to replace than bomber crews. A rational cost-benefit analysis suggested that wing strikes were inefficient. But the pilots who used wing strikes weren't thinking in terms of strategic cost-benefit analysis. They were thinking about the men in that specific bomber right now who would die in the next 30 seconds if someone didn't stop the German fighter attacking them. The ethical dimension is complex. Was it heroic or reckless? Brave or foolish? Self-sacrificing or unnecessarily dangerous? The answer probably depends on your perspective. Bomber crews who were saved by wing strikes certainly considered it heroic. Other fighter pilots who thought there were better ways to handle the situation might have considered it reckless. What's clear is that the pilots who attempted wing strikes believed they were doing the right thing. They accepted the risks because the alternative, watching bombers die, was unacceptable to them. There's also the question of whether wing strikes were even militarily effective. How many bombers were actually saved by this tactic? The documented cases number perhaps 8 to 12 confirmed instances. That's a tiny fraction of the thousands of bomber escort missions flown during 1944 and 1945. From a big-picture strategic view, wing strikes had negligible impact on the war. They destroyed a handful of German fighters out of thousands engaged. They saved a few bombers out of tens of thousands that flew missions. But from the perspective of the crews in those specific bombers, the impact was total. 10 men per bomber, perhaps 100 to 120 men. Total who lived because someone was willing to break the rules and ram a German fighter with his wingtip. Those men went home to their families. They had children and grandchildren. The ripple effects of those saved lives extended through decades. The long-term impact of wing strikes on bomber morale was also significant. Word spread through bomber groups that Mustang pilots wouldn't abandon them. Even when out of ammunition, bomber crews knew that their escorts were willing to risk everything to bring them home. This trust was psychologically important. Bomber crews flew into horrific situations, flak that could shred aircraft, fighters that attacked in coordinated waves, mechanical failures that occurred at 25,000 feet over enemy territory. Knowing that the escorts were committed to protecting them provided a measure of psychological reassurance. Some bomber crews reported that just seeing P-51s nearby, even if those fighters weren't actively engaging enemy aircraft, reduced their stress and helped them focus on their bombing mission. The strategic effect was indirect but real. Better morale led to better performance. Bomber crews who trusted their escorts were more likely to maintain formation discipline, complete their bombing runs accurately, and support each other during attacks. The controversy around wing strikes never fully resolved during the war. The Army Air Force never officially approved the tactic, never incorporated it into training, and never recommended it as a legitimate combat technique. But they also never court-martialed anyone for using it. The unofficial policy was, don't do it, but if you do and it works, we'll pretend we didn't notice. This ambiguity was probably the right approach. Officially endorsing wing strikes would have encouraged reckless behavior and likely led to unnecessary casualties, but punishing pilots who used the tactic successfully would have damaged morale and sent the message that following rules mattered more than saving lives. The gray area allowed commanders to maintain discipline while acknowledging that combat sometimes requires decisions that don't fit neatly into regulations. The P-51 Mustang wasn't the only American fighter escorting bombers over Germany. but it was the only one where wing strikes were regularly attempted and survived. Understanding why requires examining the engineering differences between American fighter aircraft. The P-47 Thunderbolt. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was the other primary American escort fighter. The P-47 was massive, the largest single-engine fighter of World War II. It was powered by a Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engine producing over 2,000 horsepower. The P-47 was extraordinarily tough. Its radial engine could absorb tremendous battle damage and keep running. The airframe was heavily built and could withstand combat damage that would destroy other fighters. But the P-47's mass worked against it in wing strike attempts. The radial engine in the nose weighed over 2,400 pounds, significantly forward of the aircraft's center of gravity. This created a nose-heavy configuration that required careful weight distribution. When a P-47 suffered asymmetric wing damage, the weight imbalance became severe. The heavy nose combined with reduced lift on one wing created control problems that were difficult to manage. Several P-47 pilots who attempted wing strikes or suffered accidental wing damage in combat reported that the aircraft became nearly uncontrollable. Additionally, the P-47's wing structure, while very strong, was designed for durability rather than rigidity. The wing could flex significantly under load, which was actually advantageous for absorbing stress during high-G maneuvers, but this flexibility meant that impact damage could propagate along the wing structure more readily than in the stiffer Mustang wing. P-47 pilots rarely attempted wing strikes. The few documented cases generally resulted in more severe damage to the P-47 than comparable impacts suffered by P-51s. The P-38 Lightning. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning was a twin-engine fighter with a unique configuration. Two engines mounted in booms on either side of a central nacelle that housed the pilot and armament. The P-38's wing was shared between the two booms, with each boom essentially acting as a wingtip. This configuration made wing strikes essentially impossible. Any impact to the wing would likely damage the engine boom, which could result in engine failure, fuel tank rupture, or structural failure of the boom itself. No documented cases exist of P-38 pilots attempting wing strikes. The aircraft's configuration simply didn't allow it. British fighters, Spitfire and Tempest. British fighters serving alongside American bombers in 1944–45 included the Supermarine Spitfire and Hawker Tempest. The Spitfire's famous elliptical wing was a marvel of aerodynamic efficiency, but it was designed with different priorities than the Mustang's wing. The Spitfire wing emphasized maneuverability and low-speed handling. It was more flexible than the Mustang's wing, designed to twist and flex during maneuvers rather than resist deformation. This flexibility made the Spitfire responsive and agile, but it also meant the wing was more vulnerable to impact damage. A wing strike would likely cause structural damage that propagated into the main wing structure, potentially causing catastrophic failure. British doctrine also emphasized gun combat over ramming. RAF pilots were trained to use their aircraft's superior maneuverability to position for gun attacks. Ramming was considered a last resort, and even then, it was discouraged unless absolutely necessary. The Hawker Tempest had a stronger wing structure than the Spitfire, but it was still not comparable to the Mustang's laminar flow wing in terms of rigidity. No documented cases exist of British pilots successfully using wing strikes against German fighters. Why the Mustang was unique. The P-51's advantage came from the convergence of several design factors. First, the laminar flow wing required exceptional rigidity to maintain its aerodynamic properties. This rigidity meant impacts were absorbed by the wingtip structure rather than propagating into the main wing. Second, the Mustang's overall weight distribution was balanced. The Packard Merlin engine, while powerful, was relatively light compared to the P-47's radial engine. This meant wing damage didn't create the same severe control problems. Third, the Mustang's wing loading, the aircraft's weight divided by wing area, was relatively low. This meant each section of wing carried less load. Losing a section of wingtip reduced total lift, but not catastrophically. Fourth, the Mustang's control surfaces remained effective even with wingtip damage. The ailerons which control roll were positioned inboard on the wing, not at the tips. A damaged wingtip reduced roll authority but didn't eliminate it entirely. Finally, the Mustang's stall characteristics were benign. The aircraft didn't have vicious stall behavior, which meant pilots could fly at slower speeds with damaged wings without risking loss of control. All of these factors combined to create an aircraft that could survive wing strikes that would have destroyed other fighters. The unintended consequence. North American Aviation never designed the P-51 to ram enemy aircraft. The laminar flow wing was designed for range and speed, not combat durability. The structural rigidity was intended to maintain aerodynamic efficiency, not to survive impacts. But the engineering choices made for one purpose created capabilities that served a completely different purpose. The Mustang's wing could do things its designers never imagined, because the structural properties happened to align with requirements that weren't part of the original design brief. This is a common pattern in military technology. Capabilities emerge from the interaction of design features in ways that weren't predicted or intended. The P-51 became the only fighter where wing strikes were survivable, not because anyone planned it that way, but because the engineering happened to work out. It's a reminder that the most important capabilities of a weapon system aren't always the ones the designers focused on. Sometimes unexpected properties matter more than intended features. The wing strike tactic was never common. Out of thousands of P-51 escort missions flown during 1944 and 1945, documented wing strikes number perhaps 10 to 15 confirmed cases. But those rare instances matter because they reveal something important about the men who flew those missions. When regulations conflicted with saving lives, some pilots chose to ignore the regulations. When the conventional options ran out, they improvised. When their weapons failed, they became the weapon. This wasn't recklessness, it wasn't hot-dogging or glory-seeking. It was calculated desperation by men who understood the risks and accepted them because the alternative was unacceptable. The bomber crews who were saved remembered. After the war, several bomber veterans sought out the fighter pilots who had protected them, including pilots who had used wing strikes to destroy German fighters attacking their formations. One B-17 crew tracked down Frank Burchill decades after the war. They wanted to thank him personally for saving their lives on March 6, 1944. Burchill, by then an elderly man, reportedly became emotional. He said he'd only done what anyone would have done, though the bomber crew disagreed. Not everyone would have risked ramming a German fighter to save strangers. The engineering legacy of the P-51's wing strike capability is subtle. Post-war aircraft designers studied the Mustang's structural characteristics extensively. The principles of wing rigidity and load distribution informed later fighter designs, though not specifically for ramming purposes. The laminar flow wing concept itself evolved significantly. Modern fighter aircraft use supercritical airfoils and other advanced designs, but the core insight that carefully controlled airflow can dramatically reduce drag remains central to aircraft design. The tactical legacy is more about what wing strikes represented than what they accomplished. They demonstrated that pilots would go to extraordinary lengths to protect the men they were responsible for. They showed that the bonds between fighters and bombers were personal, not just professional. In modern air combat, wing strikes are obsolete. Modern fighters use missiles that engage from beyond visual range. Close-in combat is rare. The scenarios that led to wing strikes in World War II simply don't occur anymore. But the underlying principle remains relevant. When the situation becomes desperate, when conventional options fail, adaptable forces find new solutions. Sometimes those solutions violate doctrine. Sometimes they're dangerous and unauthorized. But if they work, if they save lives, they matter. The P-51 Mustang wing strike tactic was illegal, dangerous, and rarely used. It was also real, documented, and effective when it was needed. The pilots who used it weren't heroes in the traditional sense. They didn't charge into battle seeking glory. They were professionals who found themselves in impossible situations and made the hard choice to break rules rather than watch men die. They understood that aircraft are replaceable. Pilots, bombers, and crews are not. When forced to choose between protecting machines and protecting men, they chose the men. In the end, that's what matters most about this story. Not the engineering, not the tactics, not the regulations, or the controversy. What matters is that when faced with the choice between following orders and saving lives, some pilots chose to save lives. They used their wings because they'd run out of ammunition. They risked everything because the alternative was watching bombers burn. They became the weapon because nothing else was left. And because of that choice, made in seconds at 25,000 feet over hostile territory, men lived who otherwise would have died. Those men went home. They had families, careers, long lives that wouldn't have existed if a fighter pilot hadn't been willing to break every rule. That's the legacy of the wing strike. Not the kills, not the tactics. The lives saved by men who refused to give up when their guns ran dry. When Mustangs ran out of ammo, some pilots found another way. They found a way that shouldn't have worked, that broke every regulation, that by all logic should have killed them. But it didn't. The engineering was just good enough. The pilots were just skilled enough. The desperation was just strong enough. And the bombers came home.